Good afternoon. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Jagera peoples as the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders, knowledge holders and leaders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Between 1803 and 1853, approximately 73,000 men, women and children were transported from throughout the British Empire to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania. Of these 73,000 convicts, 13,500 were women. Tasmanian historian Alison Alexander writes that just over 21,000 ex-convicts can be demonstrated to have departed Van Diemen's Land between 1847 and 1853, bound for Victoria and places further afield, but that the true figure is more likely to be 35,000 to 50,000, as many thousands of emancipated convicts left Tasmania after 1853. This topic is particularly current at the moment with the release of Janet McCalman's new book, Vandemonians, The Repressed History of Colonial Victoria, which traces the lives of Tasmanian convicts who set out across the Bass Strait and to see what became of them and their children in Victoria. Some appeared successful, including Sarah Rickley and her second husband, both convicts, while others were not, like Ellen Miles, who was arrested on the steps of the Melbourne Hospital. Pictured here in McCalman's book with extracts from her Victorian prison record and her convict conduct record from Van Diemen's Land. Janet McCalman agrees with Alison Alexander and other researchers of Tasmania's convict history who believe that as many as half of Tasmania's 73,000 convicts departed the penal island to start a new life somewhere else. Amongst these Tasmanian ex-convicts were families, often comprising an ex-convict woman, her ex-convict husband and their children, who travelled north to Victoria or New South Wales, and maybe then on to Queensland from about the 1850s right through to the first decade of the 1900s. This presentation will explore the stories of 13 female ex-convicts and their families who sought to make a fresh start as free settlers and pioneers in Australia's northernmost district. The arrival of convict expirees at Moreton Bay, as this area was still known until we separated from New South Wales in 1859, was most unwelcome. Even the so-called Irish orphan girls, who were not convicts sentenced for a criminal offence, but were sent to New South Wales as indentured servants, were considered undesirable. Historian Jessie Mitchell highlights the case of an Irish orphan girl, Catherine Levers. The Sydney Morning Herald had reported that Levers would be banished from Parramatta to Moreton Bay because she was insolent, idle, used bad language, kept bad company and beat the children. The Moreton Bay Courier of January 1850 took great offence to this, stating that it seemed that the Parramatta Police Magistrate John Hardy had decided that Moreton Bay is the proper receptacle for all who are too bad for contact with the highly aristocratic, polished and virtuous Parramattonians over whom he presides. We have had blows from all quarters, but this is the worst, the most humiliating, Parramatta tossing its head at Moreton Bay. The newspaper implored its readers to repel the insinuation that the male residents of Moreton Bay were no better than the bad company that Catherine Levers preferred to keep. Let them show to the colony and to England that they are not, as it seems they are thought to be, of the same order as the unhappy persons who laboured and bled on this spot 10 years ago. Of course, the newspaper was referring to convicts at the Moreton Bay Penal Settlement. The residents of Moreton Bay were keen to play down the district's recent past as the site of a penal settlement for punishing errant convicts, as well as its fearsome reputation arising, possibly unfairly, from Captain Patrick Logan's reported fondness of the lash. However, there was nothing stopping ex-convicts from settling in Moreton Bay, and this they did in droves, with nearly 2,500 ex-convicts counted in the 1851 New South Wales census of Moreton Bay, constituting 1/3 of the population at the time. This was of grave concern, even in New South Wales, which itself had been a penal colony. In 1850, the colony's politicians protested plans by Van Diemen's Land to issue tickets of leave to 12,000 convicts, imagining that New South Wales would be flooded with thousands of robbers and murderers. Even William Charles Wentworth, the son of Darcy Wentworth, and his common-law wife, Catherine Crowley, a convict, was reported to have told his parliamentary colleagues that in the course of the next year there will be an eruption into the streets of our city of several thousands of the most depraved and abandoned of human beings. Presumably he did not include his own mother in this category. It appears that there was a hierarchy in operation, with Van Diemen's Land convicts considered to be worse than than New South Wales convicts, at least by the people of New South Wales. And those who had been sentenced to a place of secondary punishment, like Moreton Bay, Norfolk Island, or Port Arthur, categorised as the lowest of all. It is against this somewhat heated background that 13 female ex-convicts, originally transported to Van Diemen's Land, began to arrive in Queensland from the 1850s onwards. Understandably, they hid their convict backgrounds, and particularly that they had been transported to Van Diemen's Land rather than New South Wales. Some of their stories have come to light because of the trailblazing work by the researchers, including descendants, who volunteer with the Female Convicts Research Centre in Hobart, and which maintains an impressively detailed database of all 13,500 women transported to Van Diemen's Land. The presence of other Tasmanian female convicts in Queensland has been revealed through the individual efforts of descendants who have conducted many years of research, often being misled by false immigration details, name changes, and other red herrings deliberately designed to throw the curious off the trail. One of these descendants is here today, Barbara Perry, whose ancestor Jane Clark was transported on the ship Mexborough, arriving in Hobart in 1841. Jane was a 17-year-old nurse girl from Belfast in what is now Northern Ireland. She was convicted of the offence of stealing a lady's dress. In 1846, 5 years after arriving in Van Diemen's Land, Jane Clark received permission to marry the convict Thomas Sandford, who was transported to Hobart on the ship Sarah in 1837. Their only child, Phoebe Sandford, was born in Launceston in 1849, the same year that Thomas died. Meticulous research by Barbara Perry has revealed that the newly widowed Jane sailed to New South Wales on the brig William in 1850, and that by 1863 she was in Mudgee, 260 kilometres to the northwest of Sydney, where she married Absalom Uren, described on their marriage certificate as a gold digger. Jane's daughter, Phoebe Sandford, married William Brown in Narrabri in 1868, and appears to have remained in New South Wales for the rest of her life. However, there appeared to be no further trace of Absalom and Jane Uren, but after many years of hitting genealogical brick walls, Barbara Perry finally discovered that Jane Uren, daughter of Patrick and Jane Clark, died in Gympie in 1878, aged just 49, of cancer of the tongue. The informant, her husband Absalom, stated that Jane had been in Queensland for 8 years, meaning that the couple moved to Queensland in 1870, 3 years after gold was discovered at Gympie in 1867. I'm also in contact with the descendant of Henry and Ann Geer, both transported to Van Diemen's Land, who arrived in Queensland via New South Wales in the mid-1860s. Ann Duffin, as she was called, was transported to Hobart on the Barretto Junior in 1850 after she and 4 other women were convicted in the Glasgow Court of Justiciary, or their High Court, of robbing and assaulting a gamekeeper at Greenock, west of Glasgow. Anne emphatically declared her innocence, but was sentenced to 7 years transportation. She's described in the Tasmanian convict records as an 18-year-old country servant born in County Tyrone, Ireland. But the Scottish trial records state that she was of Paisley, meaning born in Paisley. Despite many years of research, including obtaining copies of Ann Duffin's trial records, it has still not been established exactly where or when Anne was born. Was it County Tyrone in Ireland or Paisley in Scotland? Nor how she came to be in Greenock, west of Glasgow, where she was arrested. Anne married Henry Geer, a convict who arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the ship Marion in 1851. Henry's background has been considerably easier to trace, as his Tasmanian convict records, which are far more detailed than New South Wales records, name his parents as John and Sarah Geer of St George's Parish, London. It also name his 3 brothers and 6 sisters, John, George, Charles, Caroline, Sarah, Anne, Martha, Emma, and Mary Ann. This information facilitated the location of Henry's baptism record, which records the occupation of his father as a musician. Henry and Anne's first child, John, was born in Hobart in 1852, but died there in 1854. 3 more children were born in Sydney, but sadly only Mary Ann survived childhood. The 2 youngest children, Emma, known as Alice, and Thomas, were born in Queensland in 1867 and 1869. This places the family's arrival in Queensland in the mid-1860s. From 1869, Henry Geer's name regularly appeared in Brisbane newspapers in relation to various businesses and claims before the Petty Debts Court. An 1876 advertisement spruiking the sale of a large volume of goods described Henry as the well-known broker of Albert Street. By 1883, he had been granted a pawnbroker's licence and had moved his premises to Adelaide Street. However, despite the many traces of Henry's ups and downs as a business owner, there is only one newspaper report in which his wife Anne is mentioned. In June 1884, Anne Geer, wife of Henry Geer, a licensed pawnbroker in Adelaide Street, gave evidence in the City Police Court that R.G., described as a Chinaman, came into their shop to pawn a silver hunting watch, requesting a loan of £1. Anne stated that she gave R.G. the money and a ticket, but later gave the watch to her husband, who handed it to the police. The owner of the watch, a local plumber, said it was stolen from him while he was in a hotel a few months earlier. The case was adjourned and R.G.'s bail was set at the very considerable sum of £80. Henry Geer died in November 1888 and is buried at Brisbane's Toowong Cemetery. 3 months later, an advertisement appeared in Brisbane's Telegraph newspaper stating that Anne Geer, widow, had submitted an application for the registration of transmission of title for several parcels of land from her deceased husband, so it seemed that the couple had done very well since moving to Queensland. In January 1894, Henry and Anne Geer's unmarried daughter Alice died and was buried at the Toowong Cemetery, but in a different section to her father. In 1899, when Anne Geer died, she was buried in the same plot as Alice, rather than with Henry. From an historical perspective, that turned out to be a fortuitous decision because Henry Geer's headstone has long since disappeared, but that of Anne Geer and her daughter Alice is still visible, forming part of Brisbane's long forgotten and neglected convict past. Sophia, or Kezia Grantham, a bonnet maker, was transported to Van Diemen's Land on the ship Raja in 1841. She and her husband, John Tregilgas, have a large number of descendants throughout Australia, several of whom I'm in contact with, and have generously shared their research with me. Sophia Grantham is one of the best known of the Tasmanian female convicts, partly because on their journey to Australia, the convict women of the Raja sewed a quilt which was presented to the Lieutenant Governor's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, and is now in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia. Sophia had a child, John William Grantham, in January 1843 at the Launceston Female Factory. Then, 6 months after the birth of a daughter, Ruth, in April 1845, Sophia married John Tregilgas, a mariner, in Hobart. The family departed Tasmania for Melbourne, where 10-year-old John Grantham died in an accident in 1853. By 1855, they'd moved again and were settled at Taroom on the Dawson River, about 200 kilometres south of Rockhampton, where John Tregilgas obtained a publican's licence for the Leichhardt Arms. However, by December 1960, it seems that business was not going so well for John Tregilgas. He placed an advertisement in the Moreton Bay Courier seeking to defend his reputation. "Sir, I wish to mention to the public at large how I came to this country. I came in the favourite sloop of war and was a second-class boy when Captain Croker lost his life at Tonga Taboo. I was married in Van Diemen's Land to one Sophia Vesia Grantham, which was a servant of Parson Turner's, and was married in the Wesleyan Chapel in Hobart Town by Mr. Manton. And if anyone can say that I am a thief and a robber and the worst character on the Dawson, let them prove it, and not say that the government will take such a case in hand." By 1863, Sophia was advertising in her own name, offering board, lodging and washing for 18 shillings per week. In 1865, she was running the Cornish Mount Hotel, and in 1866, Sophia opened the Bridge Hotel, presumably seeking to make money from travellers on their way to the goldfields. Mrs. Tregilgas begs to inform her friends and the public that she has opened the above hotel at the turning off road to the diggings, and that travellers can be accommodated with meals at all hours, large paddocks, for horses, presumably. The following year, calling herself Mrs. Kezia Tregilgas, she advertised yet another establishment, stating that she begs to inform her friends and the public that she has moved from the Bridge Inn to the Bird in Hand, Derby Street. Despite the positive tone of the advertisements, Sophia's marriage had broken down. Trudy Cowley and Diane Snowden write in their book, Patchwork Prisoners, the Raja Quilt and the Women Who Made It, that Sophia displayed great strength of character in divesting herself of her husband and bringing him to court in Rockhampton. In January 1868, the Rockhampton Bulletin reported that John Tregilgas was charged with being illegally on the premises of Sophia Kezia Tregilgas on the night of the 31st of December. From the evidence of Mrs. Tregilgas, it appeared that she had a magistrate's order dated the 25th of September 1865 to live separately from her husband, and that since that time she had lived on her own earnings, and that the prisoner had given her nothing for support. She, Sophia, had ordered him out of the house, but he would not go, and she gave him in the charge of the police. Perhaps even more unusual is a long letter printed in the Northern Argus in April 1868, not long after Sophia took her husband to court, which reads, in part, and I stress this is a very small part of the letter, in Thursday's issue of the Bulletin appears a paragraph which prompts my attention. It is there stated in the most positive manner that a digger named John Ryan was robbed of £110 in my house, the Bird in Hand Hotel, Derby Street, on Easter Monday night. Before proceeding to state the facts of the case, I would ask both you and the public whether it is fair that a person engaged in a business like mine, the success of which depends upon the character of the house, should be thus open to injury by the false accusations of a scoundrel or by the too hasty publications of his untruths by a paper which appears to take a special delight in furnishing its readers with criminal and other sensational news. Perhaps we could say that there has been no change in recent years. The question is, did Sophia write this detailed and eloquent letter, one of the few, if not the only surviving example of written communication by a female ex-convict in Queensland, or did her solicitor write it on her behalf? In either scenario, I suggest, we glimpse a financially independent and successful businesswoman capable of defending her reputation and her livelihood. Unfortunately, Sophia's health gave way in 1873 when she was only 52 years old. A few weeks later, her only surviving child, Ruth Isles, nee Tregilgas, died aged 27 from septicemia following childbirth, leaving behind a grieving husband, a newborn baby, and 5 young children. Sophia is buried in the Springshire Cemetery to the west of Gladstone, under a headstone inscribed with the name Kezia Tregilgas. Anne Harris was convicted of larceny at the Exeter Quarter Sessions and transported to Van Diemen's Land on the ship Asia in 1847. In 1848, like many Tasmanian female convicts, she spent time at the Cascades Female Factory. In her case, it was 6 months hard labour for stealing a quart of wine. Then in 1850, Anne married Frederick Thomas Paddon, also a convict, who was transported to Hobart in 1843. The Paddons had 7 children, all born in Tasmania between 1851 and 1865. The family is first mentioned in Brisbane's Telegraph newspaper in December 1875, when it was recorded that Fanny Paddon, aged about 15, was admitted to the Brisbane hospital in a critical state after her clothes caught fire and she was dreadfully burnt all over her body. The following month, local newspapers were glad to learn that Fanny was in a very fair way of recovery. In September 1876, an advertisement appeared in the Telegraph newspaper, appearing to celebrate rather than hide the family's Tasmanian origins. Tasmanian House, Stanley Street, just below the bridge. Mrs. Paddon, late of Hobart Town, has opened the above as a fruiterer, greengrocer and oyster saloon and general registry office for servants of all classes. Ladies of South Brisbane may depend upon their orders being punctually attended to. Poultry Trust as ordered, Mrs. F. Paddon. As it seems unlikely that the Paddons openly discussed their transportation to Van Diemen's Land as convicts, they may have invented a new past for themselves based on the story that they were free immigrants to Tasmania. In 1877, the Paddon's 16-year-old son George, a member of the Brisbane Cadet Force, died after a short illness of 8 days and was buried at the South Brisbane Cemetery. Funeral notices were placed in Brisbane and Hobart newspapers. Daughter Elizabeth died 2 years later, aged 25, only 6 months after her marriage to Albert Heath. The Paddons' only remaining son, Frederick, died in 1881, aged 26 years, after a lingering illness of 2 years. The death notice closed with the instruction, Hobart Town Papers, please copy. Frederick Paddon Sr. died in 1892, aged about 72 years, while Anne lived a relatively long life, dying in East Brisbane in 1906, aged 82 years. All 5 are buried in side-by-side plots at the South Brisbane Cemetery, but unfortunately the headstones have long since disappeared. Having survived the trauma and dislocation of transportation to Australia, as well as multiple personal tragedies, including the severe burning of her daughter, Fanny, and the premature deaths of 3 of their 7 children, Anne Paddon, nee Harris, appears to have displayed a remarkable resilience and endurance, living until the early years of the 20th century. Like Anne Harris, Mary Ann Harriman also arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the ship Asia in 1847. Born in about 1816, she was convicted in Warwick, England in January 1847 and arrived in Hobart in July that year. In December 1851, Mary Ann applied to marry John Martin, a convict transported on the Lord Lyndoch, and they were married in February 1852. The couple had 7 children in Tasmania, and another 3 were born in Queensland in 1863, 1865 and 1868. Mary Ann Martin nee Harriman died at Cawdor, Queensland in December 1897 and is buried at the Drayton Cemetery. A memorial plaque to John Martin and his wife Mary Ann was erected at the cemetery by descendants at a family reunion in 2009. Elizabeth Telfer was convicted at Glasgow, Scotland on the 31st of December 1842 and transported to Hobart on the Woodbridge in 1843. Scottish trial documents reveal that she was 17 years old, born in Campbelltown in Argyll, and had been in service but had recently lost her position. She was charged with stealing goods from the shop of a draper on Candlewick Street. Elizabeth's Tasmanian conduct record, which is very difficult to read, reveals that her father and brother were both named Colin Telfer and that she had 2 sisters, Margaret and Mary. This information has proved vital in tracing the details of Elizabeth's pre-transportation life, including the identification of her parents as Colin Telfer, a baker, and Elizabeth Kelly, both of Campbelltown. As noted in the conduct record, in 1842, not long before Elizabeth was arrested, her father Colin was convicted of theft and sentenced to 7 years transportation. However, there is no record of his transportation to Australia, so he may have remained in prison or perhaps even died there. In 1847, Elizabeth Telfer married Oswald Charles Hitchcock, alias John Jones, in Hobart. Hitchcock was transported to New South Wales on the Lady Faversham in 1830, but found his way to Van Diemen's Land prior to his 1847 marriage to Elizabeth. 4 of the couple's children were born in Tasmania, 2 were born in Shoalhaven in New South Wales, and the youngest 2 were born in Queensland, John in 1862 and Mary Annie in 1865. By 1870, Oswald Hitchcock, a carpenter, was advertising his services as a Brisbane undertaker. Oswald died at the family's residence in Wickham Street, Fortitude Valley in 1883, aged 72. Elizabeth lived for considerably longer. In October 1901, after living in Queensland for over 35 years, Elizabeth Hitchcock nee Telfer died at Kangaroo Point, aged about 81, though her headstone says she was 78 years and 6 months old. Oswald and Elizabeth are buried together at the Toowong Cemetery. Margaret Reardon was transported to Van Diemen's Land on the Maria II in 1849, but doesn't appear to have arrived here until the early 1900s. According to Margaret's death certificate, she married Thomas Hinchcliffe in Brighton, Tasmania at the age of 17 years, and William Jones in Hobart at the age of 29 years. Susan Jones, Margaret's eldest child by her second husband, married James Sargent in Richmond, Tasmania in September 1880. And by 1886 they'd moved to Corowa in New South Wales, where they had a property named Kentucky. According to a 1931 Dalby Herald article, the Sargents, originally from Tasmania, had moved to Jingy Gully in the Jandowae district over 20 years earlier. This ties in with the first appearance of Susan and James Sargent living at Jandowae in the Queensland electoral rolls of 1909. Susan's ex-convict mother Margaret wasn't listed in the electoral roll in 1909 or any other year, but it seems likely that that's when she moved to Jandowae with her daughter and son-in-law. So as you can see from the death certificate here, Margaret Jones nee Reardon died on the 22nd of January 1915 at Glenbrook Farm, Jandowae, near Dalby. She was aged 83 years and 9 months, and according to her death certificate had been 72 years in New South Wales, Tasmania and Queensland. She was survived by 3 Hinchcliffe children from her first marriage and 3 Jones children from her second, and another 3 female children were deceased. No mention was made of Margaret's arrival in Van Diemen's Land as a convict. However, enough clues were provided for descendants to work backwards from the death certificate to establish that she was in fact Margaret Reardon, a convict transported on the Maria II to Hobart in 1849. Margaret Smith was transported on the Midlothian to Hobart in 1853, and she was possibly the last female emancipist from either New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land to have died in Queensland. Born and tried in Derry, Ireland, she was an 18-year-old house servant with 1 previous conviction. In July 1856, she married William Millwood, a convict transported to Van Diemen's Land on the Lady Kennaway in 1851. They married at the Roman Catholic Church of St Joseph in Hobart Town. St Joseph's Church, the oldest Catholic church in Hobart, celebrated its first Mass on Christmas Day 1841. The Millwoods' 3rd child, Thomas, was born in Queensland on the 18th of January 1859, dating their move north to 1858. In total, 7 of the Millwoods' 9 children were born in Queensland. Traces of the family can also be glimpsed in the Warwick Examiner and Times. William Millwood was one of the signatories to a letter addressed to the Bench of Magistrates, Warwick, in April 1875. In 1883, Ellen, described as the second daughter of William Millwood Killarney, was married at St Mark's Church in Warwick, and in August 1891, Margaret Millwood, residing at Killarney, gave evidence at a trial into the concealment of a birth by her neighbours. In March 1916, Margaret Millwood, née Smith, died at Spring Creek, Killarney, aged about 81, possibly making her the last known female convict to have died in Queensland, and one of the state's longest resident emancipists, having lived on the Darling Downs for about 58 years. Unfortunately, her headstone at Killarney appears not to have survived, and that of her husband, William Millwood, is in a bad state of repair. The next 4 women were identified in the registers of the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum, which operated on Strathclyde Island from 1865 to 1946. The admission register for each woman included her history prior to arriving at the asylum. Although brief, these can be read as micro or mini narratives containing echoes of each woman's voice. Occasionally, they are even recorded using the first person I. For instance, Mary Adams was admitted to the asylum in 1878, suffering senile decay and diabetes. And she described her passage to Van Diemen's Land and her subsequent travels north through New South Wales to Queensland. The 78-year-old's history recorded that she came to Hobart, on the ship Duke of Cornwall about 36 years ago. Bond, meaning convict, came to New South Wales about 20 years ago. Queensland about 7 years ago. Lived with Mr. Hammond for 12 months till my husband died. I then lived at St George's Bridge about 6 years. Combining this information from the Dunwich registers with additional details, including Adams' maiden name of Sutton, allowed her to be located in the indent of the Duke of Cornwall that sailed into Hobart in 1850. Mary Sutton's conduct record states that she married Zachariah Hardman in Van Diemen's Land in 1853 and obtained a conditional pardon in 1854. Then, as she related to the staff at the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum, she moved to New South Wales in about 1862, Queensland in about 1871, and St George's Bridge, 500 kilometres west of Brisbane, in about 1872. In 1876, as Mary Hardman, she married John Francis Adams. A newspaper report described the unconventional circumstances of the marriage. Mr. Adams is the philanthropic gentleman who advertised some time ago in a contemporary journal for a housekeeper, one who has known sorrow preferred, he said. A mature lady applied for the billet, but as Mr. Adams was a single gentleman, she could not live with him with credit to her reputation, except a marriage ceremony took place. Mr. Adams agreed to this arrangement. However, according to another report, it appeared that the new bride quickly became a victim of domestic violence. Mary Adams said, "He struck me with a tin plate and knocked me off the chair. My face was swelled out in consequence. He also made a blow with his hand, which caught me on the face. He then ordered me out of the house, saying, 'Begone, you,' unprintable words. I then left the house and came to town to live." John Adams told the court that his wife's statement was a tissue of falsehoods, but he was fined 20 shillings for wife-beating. Less than 18 months later, the poor Mary Adams was admitted to Dunwich Benevolent Asylum, saying that her second husband was living in Brisbane, I believe. After spending over just 1 year at the asylum, Mary died there in 1879. Another Tasmanian convict who spent her last days at the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum was Mary Ann Proctor. The Dunwich records for this woman give no clue as to a convict background, simply stating that Mary Ann Proctor, née Curran, came to Sydney in 1860. However, Mary Ann's husband, Henry Proctor, was also a Dunwich inmate, and his entry states that he was married at Hobart Town when 25 years old to Mary Ann Wallace. Descendants have pieced together a complex history, strongly inferring that Mary Ann Proctor was transported to Hobart on the Sea Queen in 1846 as Mary Ann Wallace. Henry Proctor was admitted to the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum in 1882 after going blind from an accident, and he died there in 1885. Mary Ann then went to live with her daughter Susan in Croydon, 500 kilometres west of Cairns, which was a major gold mining town. After 5 years living with her daughter, Mary Ann was sent back down to Stradbroke Island, where she was admitted to the Dunwich Asylum in 1892 with a bad throat. According to family stories, Mary Ann smoked a pipe, so it is possible that she had cancer of the throat. But whatever the cause, it seems that Mary Ann was very ill, as she died in June 1892, only 2 months after being admitted to Dunwich. The stories of Mary Groombridge and Catherine Taylor are even more difficult to research and verify. Both of their Dunwich Benevolent Asylum records state that they arrived on vessels known to have carried female convicts to Van Diemen's Land, but they were not listed on the ship's indents. However, their details, such as age and place of birth, are similar to the details of women transported under another name who later disappeared without a trace. For this reason, I believe that Mary Groombridge, who said when she was admitted to Dunwich that her maiden name was Lily and that she came to Van Diemen's Land on the ship American in 1830, was actually transported as Elizabeth Wilson on the America, not the American, arriving in Hobart in 1830. And this is because when Mary's husband, Stephen Groombridge, was admitted to the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum, he said that he married Mary Lily in Hobart in 1832. There is no record of this marriage. However, Tasmanian records show that Stephen Groombridge, who was also a convict, married Elizabeth Wilson in Hobart in 1832. The reason for Mary's apparent name change is not clear, but perhaps she was transported to Hobart using an alias, Elizabeth Wilson, and she chose to revert to her birth name of Mary Lily after leaving Tasmania. Whatever the reason, she died using the name Mary Groombridge at the Benevolent Asylum in January 1878. Similarly, I believe Catherine Taylor, née Dalton, who arrived at Dunwich in 1888 saying that she sailed to Tasmania on board the convict ship Royal Admiral, was actually transported on the ship under the name Catherine Jones. The women were of the same age and both were born in Southwark in London. Catherine Taylor stated that she arrived in Queensland in about 1868. 20 years later, in 1888, when she was admitted to the Benevolent Asylum, her husband Samuel Taylor was dead, and her sons James, John and William were in Victoria. Catherine had been living at Minnie Downs near Longreach for 5 years and said that she had no property, no cash, and no relatives in the colonies except my sons, whose whereabouts I cannot discover. Catherine Taylor died at the Dunedin Benevolent Asylum in July 1904. All 4 women originally transported to Van Diemen's Land were buried in unmarked graves at Dunwich Cemetery on Stradbroke Island. Also given paupers burials at Dunwich were another 15 female ex-convicts originally transported to New South Wales, as well as an unknown number of male ex-convicts from both penal colonies, possibly numbering in the hundreds. In fact, 8,246 inmates who died at the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum now lie in unmarked graves in the Dunwich Cemetery. Finally, we come to the story of Maria Steele. Her biography, written by Dr. Lee Butterworth, appears on the website of the Griffith University's Harry Gentle Resource Centre, which is dedicated to the research of peoples and lands of Australia, initially focusing on the area that became Queensland in 1859. Maria was born in Birmingham in about 1820. As a young woman, she was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land for stealing 2 bags of coal. Maria was transported on the ship Majestic, departing London in October 1838 and arriving in Hobart in January 1839. She was almost immediately sent from Hobart to Sydney, as she appears in New South Wales convict records noted as assigned as the servant of Mr. Bent in February 1839. In 1841, Maria married John Slater in Port Macquarie, and in 1845 she received her Certificate of Freedom. The Slaters had 2 children, Frederick and Sarah. However, the marriage was not successful and Maria left her husband to move to Kempsey, where she was employed as a housekeeper by Edgar Aldridge. Maria and Edgar lived as a couple and had 2 children, one born in 1846, a daughter born in 1846, and a son Harry, born in 1848. In 1849, Maria and Edgar were married at their residence in Clarence Street in Sydney. Later that year, the family moved to Wide Bay Village, now known as Maryborough, and lived at the Bush Inn, a single-storey hotel built by Edgar Aldridge. The family then moved into a house at Baddow in Maryborough, where they began to cultivate exotic crops and plants. Experiencing declining health, Maria passed away at her son Harry's residence at Burrell, 40 kilometres south of Maryborough, on the 7th of March 1886, aged 65 years. To honour her memory, Edgar Aldridge installed 9 bells crafted in England in the bell tower of St Paul's Church in 1888. The bells rang out each year on the anniversary of Maria's death. An inscription on the bell tower reads, "This tower with peal of 9 bells was erected by the bereaved husband and children to the honour and glory of God and in memory of Mrs. Maria Aldridge, late of Baddow House, Maryborough, a communicant of St Paul's Church. She was one of the earliest wives and mothers resident in this town, a conscientious Christian woman who through life was a peacemaker, ever forgiving, doing good, and helping all who were in trouble, distress, or affliction. Maria Aldridge, née Steele, is buried in the family vault in Maryborough along with her husband Edgar and their children." So at the conclusion of my talk today, I hope you will agree with me, firstly, that convicts from Tasmania did in fact come to Queensland. It wasn't just male convicts, it was female convicts, ex-convicts who came here, that their stories can be recovered and that they are most definitely worthwhile recovering. Thank you.